Hey guys, how's it going? This is Nate English from EnglishEndurance.com, and in this video I wanted to briefly go over how I usually approach analyzing either my own performance or somebody else's performance, like a new client for example, and how I'll look back at a previous year of training and try to use that information to kind of assess how things have gone and try to hopefully inform future decisions about how to train and how to try to get the most out of the coming season. Hopefully some of this is useful to you, and yeah, let's get to it. So usually the first thing that I'll do when I'm looking at my own year or the last month of training or whatever time period it is that I'm looking at, or if I'm looking at a new client that I'm working with and I'm trying to see where they're at and what their abilities are and how we might want to be training in the future going forward, the first thing I'll look at usually or ask them about is their peak power curve. And if you have a power meter, this is something that is very useful to know and be familiar with. And if you aren't already familiar with your peak power for 1 minute and 5 minutes and 20 minutes and pretty much throughout your peak power curve, if you're not familiar with that, I would definitely encourage you to quickly become familiar with that and see what your best was for each range of time this year and maybe over the last several years. So if you are on Training Peaks, or if you have an account with Strava and you get their premium service, this should be pretty easy to take a look at. So Training Peaks has kind of arbitrary units where they'll show you your 10 second and 12 second and 30 second, 5 minute, 20 minute and so forth peak power. So throughout whatever span of time you want to look at, whether it's the last 90 days or the last year or the last 2 years, you can look at what your best ever performance was for 5 minutes, let's say. And if you know what that is and you know what it is throughout the range, that can be very useful in kind of assessing where your fitness is at. And if you compare that to how it was last year or 2 years ago, you can assess how much progress you've made in each of those areas. And if you don't have a power meter, one of the easiest ways to do the same thing basically is to take a look at benchmark performances on some key climbs near you. Usually anything less than 30 seconds is maybe going to be too easily influenced by wind and how fast you rolled into it and anything like that, so I wouldn't worry about that. But anything that's like a minute or 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a half an hour long, that can be very useful, and from month to month and year to year, except for maybe when there's extreme wind conditions, your times on those climbs will very directly indicate your fitness level for that duration of time. And whether or not you have a power meter, I would definitely recommend having a handful of favorite climbs that you like to go hard on periodically. So that's kind of the very first thing that I would do to take a look at where you're at and how you've done maybe this year compared to last year, and where you've developed and gotten better, and also where you haven't. And that's going to maybe inform like what future decisions you might make in training. And outside of just the basic peak power curve, I would also definitely be interested in taking a look at your power profile. So let's just say how good you are for different durations of time relative to other people. So maybe your 5 second power is 1,000 watts or 600 watts or whatever it is. If you look at that number, it's like that's just a number, that's kind of nice, but how does it compare to other people relative to their weight? So like if my sprint power is, let's say, like 12 watts per kilo for 10 seconds, let's say, is that good or bad? You can look up either a chart that shows you what that would be like and what world best performances are like, and what very decent performances are like, or what just kind of average performances are like, or if you have Training Peaks, it'll kind of automatically show you that for 5 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 20 minutes, and 60 minutes. And that can give you a profile of how effectively your body has picked up on certain types of fitness and how different energy systems are working for you. and how you stack up against other athletes. So aside from just looking at in absolute terms what your peak power is like, or what your power profile is like, and how good you are at 5 minutes compared to somebody else, or 20 minutes compared to somebody else, I think that it's very good to also look at some of your key workouts and see how well you can repeat certain power. So let's say you do a VO2 max workout pretty regularly throughout the season and you do like 5 by 4 minutes. I would take a look at how much power you can do for that workout. So over that 20 minutes of VO2 max interval work, what your best performance is, and see how close that is to your absolute best 5-minute power or 4-minute power. Likewise, let's say your 20-minute power is a certain amount, but what's your 4 by 15 or 3 by 20 minute power? Or a lot of times, living around here in the Bay Area, I might finish my ride going up, an intermediate climb that might last 10 or 15 minutes long. So I know what my 10-minute peak power is, but what can I do at the end of 4.5 hours of, hard training? I think a lot of times that's going to be a better indicator of how well you can race a road race or a stage race than just what your, fresh peak power is. So like if you warm up and 40 minutes into a ride you do a full gas effort, that is all good and well, but how close your performance is at the end of 4 hours to that fresh effort is probably a good thing to keep track of. Over time, probably the gap between those two will diminish, and that's something that you can work on, but I would take that into account, or look at that as one metric that you could observe and kind of objectively see how good you're performing from year to year and what your fitness is like. So aside from just seeing what your peak power is like, or how it compares to last year, or seeing what your climbing PRs are like this year compared to last year, or what have you, I would also take a look at what races you did or what events that you did, and see which races or events you went into and you performed very well. I would take a look at those key high level performances that you did, and then take a look at what led up to that in the month or two beforehand. I would look at the hard workouts that you did and consider how those influenced your physical readiness to perform well on race day. Longer term than that, you could look at how much volume you did over the 5 or 6 months leading up to that. The volume that you did 4 months or 6 months or a year out, as you progressively built up your foundation for those hard workouts in the last month or two before your best performances in races, all of those things contribute to how things go on race day. One thing you might pay attention to if you're doing that kind of retrospective analysis is look at how much you raced leading up to what you consider to be some of your best performances, and see if you maybe raced a lot and getting a lot of intensity in helped to get you to a level of peak fitness that was beyond what you had previously had. Or maybe you didn't race much, maybe that's when you had your best performance and you only had 2 race days in the month before that. I would pay attention to that, because some people respond really well and get to new peaks when they're racing a lot. Some people don't do that so well, and maybe they need to train a lot, do a few races, train, but not over race themselves, because it'll just burn them out and end up yielding lower level race results. I would also look at when it was that you weren't performing as well, or what races you think weren't the best for you, and try to identify what it was that maybe contributed to that. If it's anything that you had any control over, I would maybe try to think about that going forward and seeing how you could make adjustments so that maybe you don't overtrain if that's what it was, or maybe you undertrained and you didn't do hard enough workouts leading up to whatever race it was. Just take into account those things. Also take into account how much recovery you get. If it was something that you couldn't control, like you got sick or it was really busy at work and you just weren't able to train as much as you would want to, that type of thing happens. It's not something to get too upset or stressed over. Most of us aren't prioritizing racing over everything else. We have work and family and whatever else to pay attention to. But if you can control it, just see what it is that you could have done or what you could do the next time differently to try to get more out of your fitness. And then one thing that I probably want to draw attention to, Training Peaks and Strava both have this type of tool where they will assess how much training stress they think you are experiencing and how fresh and how ready you are to perform well. And so on Training Peaks they call it the Performance Manager. On Strava I think they call it Fitness and Freshness. And this is an interesting tool because it's based on an assessment of how intense workouts are aerobically. And it is interesting because if your training is pretty self-similar over time and all of your workouts from week to week and month to month remain largely the same, and there are no other factors affecting your fitness like your recovery, your diet, your sleep, your stress levels, other activities that you do off the bike, if all of those things remain the same, and your recovery curve is the way that they expect it to be, these graphs can kind of tell you how much training you've had and how much investment in aerobic fitness you've had. It's definitely heavily weighted towards threshold fitness, and it doesn't take into account any other factors like what your diet's like, how well you're sleeping, how much you're sleeping, whether or not you're doing any strength work. And it doesn't take into account the fact that you could just do a lot of volume and a lot of tempo work but not any high-end intensity, or you could be doing much lower volume and a lot of high intensity work, and you might end up with similar actual objective fitness, but these graphs won't really show you that at all. So if your training is pretty similar over the course of months and years, these graphs can kind of tell you, how well your training is going. If your training does change significantly from season to season or throughout the year, these graphs are going to be relatively useless. I think they're kind of interesting. I really wish that there were ways that you could tweak them so that you could make it more effective for what it is that your training is like. And more than anything, I think that if you could factor in some sort of measure of how good your recovery is. Right now they're heavily weighted towards just threshold fitness, and that's only one dimension of a more complex system. So I would, take that with a grain of salt. I think that, TSS and CTL, all those things that you'll see on Training Peaks or the equivalent in Strava, they're interesting. They are not necessarily as useful as some people, I think, claim them to be. But that's just, my thought on it from thinking about it from a variety of perspectives and seeing over the years how much, intensity and recovery and volume and diet can all drastically impact the outcomes of your training. So training is definitely one very significant component of your overall fitness, but there's a lot more that goes into it.